Running Light Ministry podcast is brought to you by listeners like you. You can support these podcasts by making a gift to the ministries at runninglight.org.
Hey everybody, welcome to another Running Light, Better Pleasure podcast. I'm Beau.
I'm Peter.
And we are doing a part 2 of this wonderful article called Seduced by Sissy Hypnosis. Gotta love that title.
Oh, yeah.
And this is kind of, why isn't anyone talking about the influence of porn on the trans trend? By, it looks like Genevieve Gluck. Genevieve, that's it, Gluck. Genevieve, what's that? Got to get better glasses. But we went through a little bit of this already. Mm-hmm. It's kind of an interesting article about this certain type of pornography that's out there called Sissy Hypnosis porn. And the writers kind of talking about how it is they describe the pornography typically involves men wearing lingerie and engaged in forced feminization, eroticizing the illusion of being made to, quote, become women through dress, makeup, and sexual submissiveness, and the fetishizing of the humiliation this brings. Though Sissy Hypno as a term seems to have only gained popularity recently, increasing significantly since 2016, according to Google search data, there are already several websites dedicated to the genre, including Sissy, these different websites.
Right.
But so Sissy Hypno, and what this article is saying is that this type of pornography is moving people, I guess, to become women.
Yeah. Or to believe that they are.
To believe that they are. So we're reading through this article a little bit and kind of talking about it. And it is a great topic. We've talked a little bit about that it is important to kind of look at what maybe pornography has contributed to the transgender uptick in our culture. And there isn't much talk about that, actually. I did kind of end our last podcast on the idea of futanari. I was corrected by one of our resident anime expert at futanari. Yeah. I said frutari, but it's futanari. And this type of pornography that's in anime that seems to me much more popular than Sissy Hypno porn. And a lot of people might go like, well, Beau, how many young people are really, into this kind of stuff? And I would say, well, first of all, how many young people are into anime?
Right.
A lot.
Right.
I mean, I would say quite a bit, right? And then I also would think that a group of those people would probably definitely know something about this futanari, and just from the crossover between anime and hentai. And there's all these little genres of anime that are kind of, in between hentai, which is hardcore anime porn, and anime. So there's this middle ground too. And this futanari is something where it's women with phallics, with penises, but they look very beautiful, the way they're portrayed. And it looks almost like it's another kind of species of human being, if you will. Right. Almost like you were watching something like The Hobbit or Lord of the Rings, and you had this group of people that were half elf and half something else.
Right.
That's kind of the vibe you get.
Right. And we talked a little bit last week about what she's describing, and this is, by the way, from the perspective of a feminist. She's not a Christian or conservative author. She's simply coming at it from the perspective of how this is affecting women.
Yep.
And she seems to be very upset about the concept of transgender men, like men who are portraying themselves as women. And she's kind of gone into a really niche part of porn in which it's not really encouraging men to be transgender. It's actually encouraging a particular fetish in which you get aroused by people perceiving you as effeminate. Now, what you're talking, though, Futanari, is I think a little bit more mainstream, because it's not portraying a fetish. It's not portraying like this fetish of men being turned on by being women. It's portraying like beings, like actual beings, who are hermaphroditic, but in a perfect sense. So, like, that's right. In modern day, I think Klinefelter syndrome is one of the terms, or intersex. But this concept of hermaphroditism has been around for like ever. Yeah. And it's people who are born with their primary sex characteristics is a little bit muddy, if you want to put it that way. They're not always entirely clear, and sometimes they can be miscategorized. They could believe that someone is a girl even though they're actually a boy, because the genitalia is so ill-defined when they're born. And so it makes sense that man, throughout the ages, right, there have been statues of hermaphrodites. There have been various goddesses and gods that have hermaphroditic qualities to them. It makes sense that humanity throughout the ages have thought about, what would it look like if there was like a perfect meld between male and female, and what would that be like? And so people have tried to recreate it, but what hentai has done, interestingly, is portrayed it in this kind of, it's like a neo-pagan kind of thing, but we're living in this modern age in which people believe that, again, there's a spectrum when it comes to gender and sex. Back in the pagan days, they saw this as like a mythological thing, like a chimera. It's not real, but it's like a cool idea to think about, some sort of an amalgamation of male and female. Nowadays, people are like, no, I am that, that they could actually feel as though they are. We hear terms today like non-binary and things like that, where people are like, I'm not really a man or a woman, I'm somewhere in between, Yeah. And I think that might be actually more appealing to a young person who doesn't feel entirely confident within their given gender.
Yeah, and it's very, I think when you look at Futanari, the difference is like if you threw up Futanari and then you threw up Hypno Sisso porn to the 14-year-old or to the 16-year-old, I guarantee most of those teenagers are going to look at Hypno Sissy porn and be like, that's weird. Yeah. And they're going to be like, that's trippy, not into it. Nope. Not around.
It's a subgenre of the BDSM community.
Yeah, it feels very much like that.
Already you're talking about the BDSM community as being like a fringe.
Yeah.
Where not a lot of people are very into it. Yeah. But then you have a fringe of a fringe. And we talked a little bit about that last week. Yeah. You have the BDSM community, and then you have on the fringes of that community this forced feminization type of pornography that she's describing. So, like you said, there's not going to be a ton of 14-year-olds who are like, like I was watching some sissy hypno last night. Right. This is not really going to happen.
But it does make sense that if Futanari is something where its appeal is it's in its beauty, right, and in its natural beauty, meaning because it's artistic. Yeah. It's showing a portrayal of something that's not real, right, but something that's imagined. Right. And that's the neat thing about fictional art, is that it can embellish and show something as ideal, right, that maybe in reality is not so ideal.
Right. That if someone actually underwent surgeries to make themselves look like that, it wouldn't look as perfect as what you're seeing in the Futanari. Yeah, for sure.
Everything's very embellished.
And even I was talking to someone the other week, and they're trying to deal with their child, and their child is teenager, and they're just like, I don't know what gender I am. I don't know what to pick, because the way that it's being portrayed to them, to young kids at this age, is kind of, you have to pick your gender. and you don't know what it is, like, because your biology says nothing about what your gender actually is. You have to figure out what it is.
Right.
And so I think a lot of younger people are kind of picking this more ambiguous thing, because it's like, well, what does it mean to feel like a man? What does it mean to feel like a woman? And they're like, I don't really know. I don't really feel like a man or a woman. Maybe I'm somewhere in between. And so again, like this futanari thing would be very appealing to them, where they're like, oh, it could be, to be in between is very beautiful. Like, it's very appealing and attractive. And there's a lot of pull in that direction. And then I don't have to pick man or woman. I could just be somewhere in this in-between space.
Yeah. And when you have characters, not real people, but just characters,
right?
Created by our artist, then, it's very impressionable. We know how impressionable that is on young people, right. But even older people. That's very impressionable. That's why kids watch cartoons, is because they find them fascinating. Yeah. And that's why we all actually are kind of attracted to the cartoon characters. Yeah. Someone asked us, I remember once when we were doing a Salvation Army group meeting, like, hey, is it okay if I watch hentai, And like, I won't watch porn, but I'll watch hentai, and our answer was, nah, that's not a good route to go.
Right.
But it's common even for adults, I think, to find, something fascinating about the artistic renditions.
Yeah.
Especially if they don't you don't see it looking painful.
Right.
It doesn't look awkward per se.
Right.
And so, it can kind of play on your brain. And I would imagine young people, because they're trying to find something that is elusive, right? And that's a really sad place to be in as a young person, any person. If you're trying to find something that's totally elusive, you'll never find it,
right.
Because there is no definition of it.
Right.
What does it feel like to be a man? Like, what's that answer? Yeah. What does it feel like to be a woman? What's that answer?
Right.
Those are elusive.
Right.
Like, how can you track that down?
Right. Especially if you're going to throw it in this really ambiguous sense of, like, gender has no actual anchor point.
Yeah, there's no biology involved.
So if it's like, oh, okay, like, I feel like a man. Well, what does that mean? I like masculine things. Well, what are masculine things?
Yeah.
Like trucks, sports, is that masculine? So you're saying that girls can't like those things? They're like, well, no, that's not what I'm saying.
Right.
Okay, so what does it mean that you have a masculine brain or a feminine brain? Like, it's a totally ambiguous thing. And like I said, who doesn't feel uncomfortable with their body when they're a teenager? I would be willing to bet that it's the vast minority of teenagers who feel confident in their bodies when they're a teenager.
Right.
You're just this awkward, as a boy, your voice is cracking, you're going through weird shifts and changes in your biology, your genitalia is doing funky things that it never did before. As a girl, like, it's even more crazy what you're going through when you're at that age. And so it's like, who wouldn't be like, I don't really feel very comfortable with my body? Well, maybe it's because I was born in the wrong body.
Right.
Like that makes a lot of sense. I think that's going to resonate for a lot of people that are struggling with that internal disassociation from their bodies. But another interesting thing, this kind of made me think about it when you were talking about the appeal of this artistic expression, is I remember years ago, there was a whole slate of movies. It was like A Scanner Darkly was one of them, and then some of the kid movies were doing it as well. Like A Christmas Carol did it, The Polar Express did it. They released a new Beowulf movie, and they were playing around. Hollywood was playing around with taking live actors, and they were superimposing animated graphics on them. Did you see that?
Oh yeah.
And they thought it was like going to be the new thing, and everybody was like, this is weird. Like, I don't like it, because there was a thought that the purpose of art is to be as real as possible. And that's why Disney right now, by the way, is doing all these live action remakes, because the idea is like, well, the animation isn't real, so we're going to make it more real. And by making it more real, we're making it better. But people are widely rejecting these things, because what we're finding out is like, well, no, the purpose of an art form is not to be real in that sense. It's not to capture like realism in the way that you're portraying things. It's actually more about captivating desire. Right? What do people want to be true, not what do people find to be true? And that's what Tolkien said in his essay on fairy stories, where he's like, why am I using the medium of fairy stories as opposed to just telling a, Victorian era story about, good and evil or whatever? And his point is that fairy stories capture something in us that we desire to be true, even though it's not. And when you look at anime and different forms of cartoon animation, the things that are being portrayed is you're able to exaggerate everything, and that is anatomically correct as well. You look at the men in anime and they're like perfectly chiseled individuals, like to a level that no human being could basically ever get to. Maybe like 0.01% of the population could ever look like that.
The one guy on the commercial, YouTube commercials, he's always like,
the dude like, eating donuts.
He's like, dude, you don't need to eat keto. It's like, what's the percentage of people that got your
that could actually look like you? And then the girls as well, their breasts are humongous, like to a cartoonish level. And,
yep.
Like everything is just exaggerated. Their eyes are huge.
Yeah, there's and it makes, and what's sad is you could see where this plays a part in sexual dysfunction of people. And what I mean by sexual dysfunction is like when you have something that's perfect like that, it's very difficult. Sex is not perfect.
Right.
And engaging in sex is not perfect. There's things that are happening in cartoons and anime and then all the threads in between it, the tiers, if you will, all the way up to hentai, that show things and it looks all safe. It looks all okay. It looks all, and I don't mean safe in the sense that the narrations are safe, like the dialogues are safe in the shows, but I'm saying that, it's not all messy. It's not all, in real sex, you have real people, you have real flaws in bodies. You have, pimples, you have this, you have that, you have birthmarks, you have this issue, you have that issue. Right. It doesn't look like, and this was the argument that people used to use when it came to pornography,
right.
Like real pornography, like, we ain't gonna look like that, but I think we were wrong.
Yeah.
I think when we look back on the arguments against real life pornography, human being pornography, I think what you find is that that's real. Mm. That is real.
Yeah.
And those women are real.
Right.
And those men are real. And there's nothing fake about that.
Right.
That, people would say, but they put on makeup, they've touched up pictures. Yeah, they've done that. And there's a reason why they touch up those pictures that were in Playboy and things like that. It's because of what you just stated, is like, we love the cleanness. We love the fantasy of it all. We like the perfection of it. We want art to reflect something that's different from what we see.
Yeah.
But when you have it when it's distributed on a level that it is today, where kids can repetitively
right.
get this kind of embellishment,
right.
Then, it would be difficult probably coming to the real.
Yeah.
Or that real is going to seem different.
Right.
And let me say this too. This might be an idea that's interesting for a lot of people, is that, a lot of people are in relationships, marriages, or just cohabitating that are very sexless.
Right.
They don't have much sex in it at all.
Right.
So it's not like their primary purpose for the relationship is sexual intimacy.
Right.
It is intimacy, but it's on a different level. It's almost like there is a replacement of sexual intimacy in our culture nowadays with the virtual sexual world that we have, and then it really stays there, and then which is really interesting too, because it's like we see that growing more and more, where people are just like, hey, let's cohabitate, let's be best buddies, let's be whatever, like we're close, we're everything like that, we hug, we kiss, but we really don't. It is not very sexual,
right?
We don't want to have kids, blah 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 blah, and they're okay with having a more virtual sexual world.
And that, like, what you're talking about, I think is very key, and something that maybe this author is missing a little bit, whereas, and many Christians miss this as well. Is pornography the problem, or is pornography a part of a much bigger problem? And that would be the disassociation from reality in general, right? So maybe what we're talking about of the struggles that young people are having with reality, this facet of pornography is just one part of it, So it's like, yes, I can have a sexual existence that's apart from my body in pornography. That's one of the benefits of it. It makes it safer, and that's why a lot of younger people are choosing it. But I could also choose to have experiences outside of my body in every other facet. I could go cook something, or I could watch a cooking show. I could go fix something, or I could watch like a home improvement show. I could go, like there are things I could go seek to be successful in my career, or I could just watch, Undercover Boss, or The Apprentice, or something like that, or Shark Tank. I could actually live vicariously through somebody else. And C.S. Lewis has that really famous line from Mere Christianity, where he didn't really see, and this is one of the rare times where C.S. Lewis didn't see the future depravity of what was going on. And he was talking about porn, and at the time he was just talking about what he understood to be porn, which would be strip clubs. And he said, if you went into a society and you saw someone like seductively taking a handkerchief off a T-bone steak, and everyone's just like losing their minds and
salivating,
like, yeah,
the T-bone.
He'd be like, you would think that something had gone wrong with their appetite. And he's like, and yet, if I could slowly undress a woman, and nobody's actually having sex with her, and people are like cheering and giving her money for it, we don't think that there's something wrong with our sexual appetite. So again, he and all these other philosophers in his day, they didn't perceive a time in which people would choose vicarious pleasure, where it's simply through voyeurism, simply through watching, and that pleasure is sufficient enough to make me not want to engage in reality. And that's kind of a radical thing.
Yeah.
Where this one author, Carl Trueman, he wrote The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, and he makes a really funny statement, and it's really hard to tell if he's a British guy, so it's like, is he being sarcastic or is he being serious? It's really hard to tell.
Yeah.
But he says at one point, he's like, I would rather someone buy a prostitute than view pornography, because he's like, at least when you have sex with a prostitute, it's in your body. You're paying her money. Like you're at least, you may have to say something to her at a certain point. There's some sort of an interaction happening where pornography is so outside of your body. It's so disconnected from reality that even if it's real, in the sense that you're watching real people, it's still so disconnected from your reality, that it is damaging to you. So
yeah,
I think that's really interesting. And again, the more disconnected from reality I become, why wouldn't I feel disconnected from my body? And if I'm disconnected from my body, why wouldn't I feel disconnected from my gender?
Yeah. It's a weird just world that we're in at this moment with the technology, because we don't know where it will go.
Right.
What is the next step? Is it something where, we will choose that fantasy world as the technology gives us more options in it? And will that be an accepted kind of lifestyle? Is that just, and that's what we're, I think, battling right now, is the fantasy way the better way?
Right.
And the difficult thing is, like, humans, we like to say, oh, well, fantasy porn's, porn's a fantasy, blah, 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 and has its ramifications. But as you talked about, we're living vicariously in many different ways through people.
Right.
And that's what the media has done. And instead of us dialoguing with people about political issues, we just want to hear people bag about it. Yeah. We just want to hear people rag on each other.
Right.
And we would rather watch people argue on, a late night talk show or something. I was thinking of Bill, is it Maher or Meyer? Bill Maher. Yeah. Like watching a show like that, you watch people argue and people go, oh, okay. But instead of you engaging in a talk or instead of you reading a book, you kind of know someone who read the book and you listen to something on YouTube of someone who's just breaking down what they learned about the book, And so we're all constantly kind of doing those things, it seems like, in our society. Where will it go? Who knows? But it seems like we're at the education has already infiltrated our life, so much so where a part of us has like an old remnant of what was, and it feels a little awkward to what is, and what is most kids by the time that they're 15 to 20 years old have already seen a vast amount of images and fantasy images and pictures of male-looking people with boobs and then women with boobs that have penises. And they've seen them in very, very polished and artistic renderings. And so it's something that is already lodged in the mind, so it's not, like you say, it's not so hard to bring a philosophy of detachment from biology to mental, your mental capability, a detachment from those things and go, hey, well, my body can be altered, to fix what I think in my brain. At this time. And, what we find is, of course, a lot of people don't ever achieve that artistic rendering that they have in their brain. Because your brain tends to, it's funny how our brains are. It's like when you think back, like you see a sunset at some point when you were, 15 years old, 16 years old, whatever. And it was really cool. You were at the beach, something like that. When you get older and you're in your 30s, 40s, 50s, and you think back on that, everything's embellished. It's amazing. Your brain doesn't see it less impactful than it was, because your brain, as it sees it sees it more impactful. And so it's like, that's why people with trauma, like when they keep having that, reliving that moment as they get older and older, it becomes even more embellished sometimes, in their mind. They go, whoa, it even becomes hardcore. Our brains tend to do that with sunsets. We go, man, I did remember that sunset was amazing. And if we were to go back there, it probably would be less than
not as good.
Less than what we're thinking in our brain.
And I was listening to a talk on the rituals that God gives the people of Israel. And they pointed out that in the book of Numbers, this embellishment that you're talking about was starting to happen in the nation of Israel, where they were starting to embellish their time in slavery. And they were like, wow, that was awesome.
We ate figs.
We ate figs and leeks, dude. That was so good. Like they're already embellishing the past to the point where it doesn't even resemble what reality was. And this commentator said that, and I thought it was a really good point, one of the reasons why God gave ritual to his people is so that they weren't embellishing the past. They were remembering it as it was. and specificity.
That's awesome.
So it's like an engaging of the body, right? To like, if you watch Jewish people celebrate like the Feast of Tabernacles, which is to commemorate the wilderness wandering, they actually got to build like a tent, like they got to live in it for a week. Yeah. And it's not just a tent, like it's a tent made out of slats. So you can't have a hard roof.
There's only one, I think, entrance to it.
And it only has one entrance and so there or one exit. And so it's like you're living in this house that, the elements are beating down on you, and it's to actually like engage in a way in what was experienced by your ancestors, so you remember.
Right.
And I really like that. And they even made the argument that sacrifice was designed for the same purpose, that when you're killing the cow, when you're killing the sheep, you're acting out the destructive nature of your sin so that you can't embellish it in your head. Like, it detracts from your ability to embellish your sin as being like to romanticize it and think of it as something that was more beautiful than it was. And I really like that idea. And they said that one of the weaknesses of Christianity is because we are a religion based on faith, people seem to think that acted out religion is kind of old fashioned and we don't do it anymore. So it's just like, well, it's what you think in your head. Well, what you're pointing out is, well, what you think in your head may not be reality. Like it may, just because you think it and just because you remember it doesn't mean it actually happened the way that you're remembering it.
Yeah, most of us, as you get older, you embellish your past with your parents. Like, how many young people go, man, my youth was so rough.
Yeah.
Like, how many young people say that?
Yeah.
Like, my family life was so hardcore.
Yeah.
And you're like, really?
Yeah.
And they're like, oh yeah, I remember it was so tough. And you go and you look into their past and it's like,
it's pretty happy.
It was pretty good.
Yeah.
It was pretty good. And I've seen that in my own life too. As I've gotten older, I've been able to look back on the past and say, man, I think I've embellished some things and have had to like look at that a little harder and go, maybe my brain is just, I was impacted by something,
right,
and it just kind of creates this fantasy,
right,
world. And how many young people that are going through sexual transition, are just thinking of a fantasy, of thinking of, yeah, this is going to be it. And this is what I'm going to be like. And this is what I'm going to look like. And it's going to be amazing, when in the reality is it's not going to be that amazing.
Right.
It's going to be painful.
And that was kind of another thing that I noticed when I was a kid. So they developed kind of Blu-ray and IMAX technology when I was a teenager. And everyone was so psyched about it. They're like, whoa, like there's like 1 billion pixels and, like it's going to look just like you're staring at someone in the face across the table from you. It's going to be amazing. And so I remember I bought a couple of like DVDs that I had, or VHSs actually at the time. I had like some VHSs of some old movies like Independence Day and stuff. And I got them on Blu-ray. And you got your HD TV, and you slip it in, you're like, wow, these graphics suck. Like, you're like, dude, this is terrible, Because like when you're watching on your janky VHS player on your tubed TV that's 26 inches, all the defects in it don't stand out. Like they're not as obvious or apparent. And so you could just kind of enjoy it for what it is. But when you got it on a 50-inch plasma with all these pixels, you could see all the flaws in the filmmaking process, and it's no longer good. And the point is that like no reality, the reason why humans are in such droves moving away from reality is because no reality can live up to your imagination that you're embellishing. And so it's easier for you to go into your imagination because it feels more correct to what you perceive as reality. But the cool thing about the Christian life, right, about God, is that what God tells people over and over again is he's like, the reason why you can't see me is because I'm so glorious that actually the more clearly you see me, the less capacity you have to take me in. In other words, God is the only being in the universe that the most that you embellish God, he's greater than that.
Right.
Like the think about the greatest thing in the universe, God's greater than that. Like your imagination can't even perceive how great God is. Like you don't even have the capacity. So for Christians, and this is what J.R.R. Tolkien, he talks a lot about it, and again in his essay on fairy stories, he says he calls it an arresting strangeness, where he's like, so he's utilizing these mythologies and stuff to talk. And so let's take one element from Tolkien's universe, the elves, right? And elves are like these perfect creatures, like everything they make is amazing, and they're immortal essentially, and they're beautiful, and everything about them is great. And he said, like, the arresting strangeness makes you kind of pause and think about like ideals. But if you think about the Tolkien universe, the elves can still become corrupted, and they can still die. There's still faults within them. And his point was like, the reason why I'm using this methodology is because, again, the gospel's even greater, right? So the myth that I'm using is to call to attention that there's a greater thing than Middle Earth. So if someone's like, man, I would love to live in the universe of Middle Earth, you'd say, no, you want to live in heaven. Like, you want where this is actually real.
Pointing to, yeah.
Not just in your imagination, but somewhere you could actually live, somewhere you could actually be. And it is real, right? The gospel is myth made real. That's what he says at the end.
Yeah.
He says it's true myth. So, the life and death of Jesus is like the greatest myth ever told, because it was real. It really happened, and he really rose from the dead, and there really is a promise of an afterlife, and there really is a pleasure that even the greatest sex you ever going to experience, the greatest sexual experience you have, is nothing compared to the pleasures that are in store for those who are in God.
Yeah, and it's really interesting. Even at the end of the book, the Bible, in the book of Revelation, you see that there's no more need, it says, for the sun and
right.
the constellations and stuff like that, which is really interesting because it says, God is there,
right.
and God is this center of it's like everybody's just taking in God.
Right.
And it's interesting because over human history is fascinated with constellations. We are fascinated with the mythology of them, and
even modern enlightened people are all into horoscopes.
That's right. But the culture, our culture is just enraptured by the vastness of the universe.
Right.
And but the point being is that God is even exceeding all of that glory,
right.
and that He is the one that you're going to be able to gaze upon at one point and just be blown away, and just continually blown away. You'll never be let down, which it's. It's almost like we've had an experiment, a media experiment, a visual media experience since TV took place, back in the 40s and in the 1940s. And here we have, we're getting, close to that 100-year mark of video media.
Right.
And now, it's interesting. It's like we would rather consume, movie upon movie and series upon series than to live in a real world. It's much easier to put on a show and watch families have issues and see how they deal with the issues and live in that, live in their world, and not really do much in your world.
Right.
We definitely have, if you will, we've in a sense maybe failed the test where we've moved away from the real,
right.
and we've chosen fantasy far over
right. reality.
Our reality is, in a sense, just to be able to preserve the ability to fantasize.
Right.
And that might be what us humans are doing. And maybe the proof of the Bible is that it's showing that there is something more in us. We constantly are craving the greater.
Right.
We're craving the fantasy.
Right.
The ideal. And why is that? Why can't we just, it's weird that we can't just shut it off.
Right.
Like, we can't just be like, oh yeah, no, not into it.
Yeah.
Yeah, like, no movies, no nothing. Why can't we just live?
Right.
And that's an interesting question nowadays.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And if this reality is all we have, which is the contention of most like atheistic people, then they should be adamantly against this, because like nobody's living in reality. Like, this is all you got, why wouldn't we want to preserve reality? For the Christian, the interesting point that we could make is again, the reason why you crave the fantasy is because there is something beyond this world to which your fantasies point. But if you're, again, what Tolkien meant by arresting strangeness is it should arrest you for a second. Like, it should capture your attention for a second, and then you go back into reality with it. Yeah. It's like if it's like taking your life over, then like something negative has happened. It's no longer an arresting strangeness. It's I think he called it a static strangeness, where you're stuck in the fantasy world and you can't come out anymore. Yeah. And that's like a negative.
And maybe that's where we're at. And maybe that's what we're seeing in the trends of transgender culture, is that we have become stuck in fantasy, and we're okay with it, there's nothing that's moving us more away from it. Instead, we're wanting to embrace it and keep going in that direction.
And I think that like it also lends to dark parodies of the truth. So it's like what we can attain within our imagination. You and I were talking about Pascal before we started the show, and Pascal, he points out the nature of the hiddenness of God, and how people complain about the hiddenness of God. They're like, well, the hiddenness of God proves that there is no God, and he says, well, couldn't it prove that you're just corrupt? That maybe there is a God and he is actually good, and that he couldn't dwell with humanity. So he's like, so it either proves that God isn't real, or it proves that we are corrupt and God is real. Right. And he's like, what do you observe? Do you observe good humanity in which there is no God and need for creator, or do you observe corrupt humanity and a need for a creator, but a simple hiddenness from him? And he argues that it's the latter. But the point of that is, like, if we are corrupt, then our imaginations are corrupt. And so even if we try to think up to the greatest ideal, we're going to corrupt it at a certain level. Right. And we're going to make it something that it isn't. And so, I think about, like, in hentai, there is constant, I wouldn't call it like bestiality, because it's not really bestiality in the way that most people would think. It's a taking of entities that aren't human, for sure, right? They're not human entities. They're demons and monsters and things like that, but they're of human intelligence, right? They're hyper intelligent beings, and they're having sexual relations with women, right? And a lot of these interactions are forced, right? They're rape and things like that, and it's portrayed in sensual terms. You're right. And it reminds me, when I think about it, it does remind me so much of Paradise Lost. And in Paradise Lost, there's an interesting instance, right? So there's this really old book about, it's kind of an embellishment of the fall of Satan. And Satan comes into the world, and he's a spiritual being, and he wants to kind of interact with the world. He wants to like become a part of the world so that he can corrupt mankind. And so he actually like moves into the body of a snake. So the way that Milton saw it is not that Satan took the form of a snake, but he actually like kind of put himself into a snake, like he possessed a snake. And there's this really like creepy part of the book. It's like a horror movie kind of deal where he's possessing the snake, and he's describing it in this really grotesque imagery and really grotesque like kind of language of him entering into the body and feeling like the cavities of the snake and the serpent, and it's corrupting him, and it's making him different. And it's really like I said, a very gross like sci-fi kind of scene that he has. And the reason why I point that out is because what do you see? You see a type of the incarnation, but a corrupted version of it, right? A type of a spiritual being becoming a part of reality. But instead of God, who doesn't just want to possess the world, God wants to actually become a human, he enters in a correct way. He doesn't inhabit someone's body. He has a body that is born in a natural sense, and he becomes a part of mankind. Instead of, and the point of like a man wanting to become a woman, instead of a man seeing like, I could be connected to the feminine through marriage and through joining myself to the woman by becoming one body with her in the act of intimacy, and through procreation, in which we're able to make a child in our image and likeness that bears both of our aspects within them. Instead of seeing that, it's like this, I could just incorporate femininity into me, right? I could just bring it into me forcibly and change my body. Or with the hentai, instead of, Tolkien's point of like us wanting to be joined to nature in some cosmic sense of wanting to actually be a part of nature in the way that God intended. And this is what Tolkien said, why we're so obsessed with like water nymphs and wood elves and things like that in our imaginations, is because we want to be a part of nature, and we recognize ourselves as being apart from nature. And it's because of the fall. We're no longer harmonious with nature, and that's what technology represents, is us pulling away from nature more and more, and being in our gated communities, in our houses with our air conditioning, like we're becoming less and less a part of nature because we find nature to be oppressive to us. And so in hentai, you have these weird instances in which nature is kind of going into women. It's specifically attacking the feminine, which I think is very interesting.
Yeah,
demons are doing that.
Yeah, like branches and trees and come alive, and they become monsters, and that kind of thing.
Exactly. And it's like I said, it's you see what in the human imagination would want that, right? There is a goodness there, but it's a perverted goodness. It's something that's corrupted.
Yeah.
Because that's what the imagination of man does. It corrupts the good.
Yeah, it's interesting, some of these quotes. It says, this is on this article that we've been kind of honing in on, but it says, this is a quote, I started watching trans porn initially 5 or so years ago, and I remember I had post-orgasm regret. Back then, I imagined myself as the guy. About 1.5 years ago, I started to imagine the possibility of being the girl in these scenarios. I wanted to be forced to have intimacy by a man because I was turned on by the submissiveness of it, and it's kind of interesting, this idea of that they point out, and that is they talk about gender dysphoria being something that is almost like a learned gender dysphoria.
Right.
That when people, like this quote that I just read, you imagine yourself, you kind of put yourself in, because now you have a media where you see these, futanaris, you see these different people, or, even if they're cartoons, or now even if you kind of see like a real person who's went through sex transition surgeries and that kind of thing.
And even in the quote, it's like you see, again, the corruption. This is in the BDSM community. I've spoken with certain individuals that are coming out of that community, and that's the interesting thing about it, is the perspective that people carry within this community. And it's not like this malicious, evil thing.
Yeah.
But you could tell it's a perversion, it's a corruption of what we would call biblical submission. So in the heart of man, we know that submission is a beautiful thing. We understand it. But in the S&M community, what they've done is they've taken submissiveness and they've fetishized it.
Yeah.
And it's becoming like, I want to be forced to do this thing against my will.
Yeah.
And that's not submission. Like, biblical submission is a surrender, to a willful surrender to what you desire, right? To God in love, right? And so there's a surrender that happens in love all the time, whether it's a surrender to your kids or a surrender to your spouse, or even your family or your friends, where you're willingly giving of yourself to others. But the idea of being forced to do something is a perversion of that willful surrender.
Yeah. It's a neat quote, this person talking about their kind of fetishes and stuff like that. You really get an insight into stuff. It says, recently I've really started questioning everything. I love the attention and consequently feeling like the woman. This has led me to some gender dysphoria as I would love to be the woman and see where that would take me in my life. You know, isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
It's like through watching, you know, a media, you know, and through, you know, their own fantasy about it and their own feelings, you know, of arousal and things like that. Then they start kind of questioning things like, I wonder what it would be like to be a woman.
Right.
You know, man, to have that happen. Well, maybe I should be a woman.
Right.
You know? And so.
And I like how this author does portray this, and a lot of women have made this point in the last couple of years about the transgender movement is even though we're saying as a culture, well, you know, like there's nothing, and I could tell why a lot of feminists would be upset about this, by the way, because the whole pull of feminism is that there's nothing inherently feminine, right? There's nothing inherently feminine. And to say that there are things that are inherently feminine degrades women, because you're basically drawing lines and saying a woman can't be these things. So to say like, well, it's masculine to be bold or to be brave or to be assertive or to be a leader, the inference that can happen and has happened throughout human history is women can't be those things, right? To be a woman means that you cannot be these things. Or to say that femininity is being nurturing or compassionate is to say to men, well, you can't be or shouldn't be nurturing, compassionate, or emotional, because that makes you less than masculine. And so there's some perversion as well in the feminist ideology, but the main thing that she's pointing out is this is a caricature of womanhood. So when these guys are watching this pornography that's showing forced submission, the idea that they're gathering is, what does it mean to be a woman? Well, what it means to be a woman is someone who is in a position of forced submission.
Right, and that's what she's arguing against, is that misogynistic, you know, like, why are you putting this on a woman?
Right.
Like, necessarily.
Why do you have to be feminine to be forced into submission?
Yeah, it's just interesting that it's moving people. You know, maybe 30 years ago, this kind of stuff, because it's always kind of feel like it's been there, you know, through cross-dressing. We've talked about that. And,
right.
You know, but maybe because technology wasn't there yet, people couldn't have this dysphoria of like, maybe I want to be the woman, you know, that's depicted in the show that I'm watching.
Right.
And instead of questioning the show, she's saying you should question the show and go, well, how is it depicting a woman?
Right.
And is that right?
Right.
You know, is that wrong? They're just assuming like, oh, well, that's the woman's role in this show.
Yeah.
And maybe there's something to that.
Right.
And there's something I like about that.
Right.
You know, and so it's interesting. You know, feminists are in a real bind, obviously, nowadays, you know, with the transgender movement. And in a sense, you know, their attacks on pornography haven't really gone very far over the years. You know, back in the 70s, feminists, you know, were really, you know, strongly against pornography.
Right. And
then you had a lot of feminists that became very pro porn.
Right.
And sexual liberation.
Right.
And now you can see they're in a real quandary over this, because now you have people that are in this kind of gender dysphoria, you know, mental state, you know, watching porn and, in a sense, stereotyping women.
Right.
And which the feminists obviously don't want that to be the case. You know, but that's kind of what's happened. You know,
and even, you know, like I think about guys like Dylan Mulvaney, who's really popular right now. He did his, you know, 365 days of girlhood. So it was a guy who transitioned to be a girl, and now he's getting all these deals like from Anheuser-Busch and now from like you know, very like Nike had him do a sports bra, tampon, Tampax has a sponsorship with him, and I think he just got a makeup brand. I think it was MAC or something like that. Maybelline. It was Maybelline. And so, but when you look at him and what he's doing, it's so clearly a caricature of a woman. You know, it's so clearly like the most stereotypical woman you could think of. That's what he's doing. And I've shown some of the days of girlhood to my wife, and I think they're kind of funny just because of how over the top they are. When you remember it's real, it becomes less funny. Yeah. But for her, she laughs, but she's also like really offended. Like I can tell she gets really offended because she's like, that's how this dude sees women. And it's like this on his first day of womanhood, quote unquote, he released a 30-second video, and it was essentially like, well, you know, it's my first day of being a woman, and I bought some clothes I didn't need, and then I changed my mind about it, and I cried for 20 minutes for no reason, and then like I ate some ice cream and regretted it.
Wow.
How did I do? You know, and it's like, that's his vision of womanhood.
Yeah, and it goes against everything that feminists have really been against. So anyway, we're going to end this podcast right now on that note, and just the wonderful contradictions that are in our world. But we'll catch you guys next time. Take care.
Check out runninglight.org to begin our 2 video series, Take Flight and Love or Lust. You can also send us questions on Twitter at Running Light or on our runninglight.org podcast page. Like us on Facebook at Running Light Ministries. Psalm 36:8. They are abundantly satisfied with the fullness of your house, and you give them drink from the river of your pleasures.